Why does my Argenti do close to no damage? Why does he feel so clunky to use? Is it truly a skill issue, or do you simply just need a better team comp? Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video, and today we will be discussing some of CN's best possible team for Argenti and looking at how can you fully maximize the amount of damage you can do, because let's be real, a unit with a 1940% damage multiplier on his ultimate is definitely going to be able to deal tons of damage, right? So without further ado, let's get into today's content. Argenti is a tried and tested hyper carry that wants as much buffs as possible, but some supports does provide substantially more benefits compared to others. As always, viable is not the same as optimal, and we will be discussing some of his most optimal team comps, benchmarking his damage output against all of the other supports. For sustains, just a quick little note, Huo is the de facto best in slot in terms of increasing his damage by the largest possible margin, not just for Argenti, but for pretty much every single DPS due to her energy regeneration. Starting right off is going to be his team building basic, and the most important part is understanding Argenti's damage composition. Like I mentioned in my CN unit analysis, Argenti's damage composition is mainly from his enhanced ultimate, taking around 60 to 80% of his total damage output. Argenti's ultimate also gains the largest increase in damage from support buffs due to its incredible multipliers. Skills that has higher multipliers will always benefit more from any source of buffs as compared to skills with lower multipliers. So it is in the best interest for players to align all of the buffs during Argenti's enhanced ultimate state. As long as the buffs are available during his enhanced ultimate state, then Argenti is going to be able to deal substantial amounts of damage. There is no need for us to have a 100% buff coverage uptime as compared to some of the other DPSs like Sile in Bibitulune, where their damage output is more or less consistent. For Argenti, it's mostly tied to his ultimate. Now going to another very important thing to understand, which is his energy, right? This is also mentioned in my CN unit analysis, specifically for Argenti's team comp. This team comp will be largely dependent on his relic setup, and in particular, do we use an energy rope or do we use an attack percentage rope? For teams with Tingyun or Huo or even both, we will be preferring to use attack percentage rope because we are able to achieve a 3-turn ultimate most of the time. For teams with pretty much no other sources of energy regeneration, then players should be running an energy regeneration rope. There is no team that is better than the other team, like Tingyun and Huo is like the best in slot team, as you guys will see very quickly. The main reason why we would ever want to use energy regeneration rope for Argenti is to ensure that we do not have a 4-turn ultimate, because if we do have a 4-turn ultimate, not to say that it is completely unplayable, but it is going to be very clunky, because most, if not all, of our supports in the game right now have a 3-turn ultimate cycle, right? Bronya, Tingyun, Yukong, Hanya, starrail. So it would be in the player's best interest to maintain and achieve Argenti with 3-turn ultimates, either through attack percentage rope with a little bit of help from any of the energy regeneration sources, or we just ensure that we get enough kills or even get hit. If we cannot achieve any of this, then we would need to run energy regeneration rope. Then one last thing, and this I believe is one of the biggest reasons why players Argenti are not performing up to task, is his mob clearing capabilities. Taking this benchmark from the CM players chart, this is essentially every single mob's HP from MOC 1 to 10. As you can see, most mobs, very little, but most mobs do not exceed 50,000 HP, and that is gonna be our benchmark as of this current moment. Going into Memory of Chaos 12 as well as Pure Fiction, then this HP is probably gonna rise, but the principle still applies, right? So based on these two charts, Argenti needs to have at least one attack percentage main, either using an attack percentage rope or an attack percentage boost, to comfortably clear mobs using 2 skills plus the very first segment of his enhanced ultimate, on top of all of the support buffs that he gather. If players are unable to clear the mobs using 2 skills plus the first segment of his enhanced ultimate, then Argenti's damage output will drastically fall off. So as long as we achieve this setup, Argenti can very comfortably clear most, if not all, of the mobs. And as a result of this, we would not be recommending players to run a speed and energy regeneration rope for any sort of team comps using Argenti. And that is going to be that for the team building basics. Going straight into his support synergies, I'll first talk about some of the single target supports, right? Bronya, to nobody's surprise, is going to be the highest damage increase, followed by Hanya, then followed by Tingyun, and the rest of those other supports is just not very high compared to these 3 units. But that being said, it is not recommended to run Argenti with a single support. 2 supports or even 3 supports can drastically increase Argenti's damage output because of the amount of benefits that that Argenti's enhanced ultimate can receive, the more buffs we gives Argenti. Argenti's enhanced ultimate has a very high multiplier, so it doesn't make sense to only give him a single support. If we are really gonna be forced to be in a situation where we have to use only one support, aside from Bronya, Hanya is incredibly synergistic as a single support due to the speed buff, attack buff, damage buff, as well as the ability to use planetary rendezvous. And before we go into the more practical double support scenario, this assumption is going to be consistent throughout the entire content today, right? We are going to be using an E0 Argenti with S5 breakfast as well as 5-10-10 subset distribution on attack percentage, crit rate, and crit damage. So just something to keep in mind. Now, going on to the double support, I think this is going to be a lot more important and a lot more relevant to most players. It's going to be seen from this chart right here. Bronya Tingyun into Bronya Yukong into Tingyun Yukong into Tingyun Hanya. But before we dive deep into this, there's two things I want to get out of the way. First of all, there's three different colors over here. The green represents Huo, purple represents Fu Xuan, and gray represents other sustains, because like I mentioned, Fu Xuan and Huo are essentially the only two sustains we have right now that can actually increase our damage output, right? Fu Xuan has the increased crit rate, while Huo has the increased attack buff as well as energy regeneration buff. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing to note is that any of the simulation that we'll be doing for Argenti's team-wide damage output is gonna vary drastically between each battle, not even between each team, each battle, even with the same allies, due to Argenti's damage output being tied to the enemy mobs. The number of enemies Argenti faces, it will directly affect his crit rate ramp up time, energy regeneration, as well as his final damage multiplier. So for example, if you're going to be going into the battle, there's 1 elite and 4 mobs. If you manage to clear all 4 mobs and then all of the remaining hits go into the elite, then his damage output will drastically increase. But for whatever reason, if Argenti fails to crit and he only managed to kill like 2 or even 3 mobs, then the damage output is going to be very different for this particular instance. So something that players need to keep in mind as well. But that aside, casting a single enhanced ultimate less is going to be a massive damage output difference. And this is also influenced from the amount of times our Argenti is going to kill an enemy target, the amount of times our Argenti is going to get hit by an enemy target, or even from our supports getting hit or getting even a support kill, right? Because this will all change the energy threshold. And as long as Argenti can cast 1 ultimate more or 1 ultimate less, it will be very different in terms of damage output. As a result, the Argenti team comp simulation, it can be comparable to Sile and Imbibitor Lune's team comp simulation, right? There's no fixed rotation, because like Sile and Imbibitor Lune, it really depends if you can get the kill. It really depends if you can get the ultimate up in time, just like how Argenti depends on when can he get his enhanced ultimate. Now we can finally go into each support and how they benefit Argenti. First of all, being Bronya. Once again, to nobody's surprise, Bronya is gonna be the biggest damage increase for pretty much almost every single DPS at this point right now, right? Extra turn, attack buff, damage buff, crit damage buff. I don't really need to repeat myself because it's the exact same buffs for all of the previous DPS. But at this point, I do want to say that even more so for Argenti, Bronya benefits him, because Argenti has extremely high damage multipliers, just like Imbibitor Lune's 3 enhanced basic attack. Higher multipliers will always gain more benefits from the buff that Argenti receive, right? And for Bronya, she has one of, if not the highest amount of buffs you can receive right now. Also, a little trick that we can use is that even if Bronya skills Argenti and he has no skill points left to use the skill, it is still perfectly fine for Argenti to just use a basic attack, right? It is still good value due to the energy regeneration. So this is also kind of tied to my very first point in Argenti's team building composition, is that majority of Argenti's damage is coming from his ultimate anyways, not from his skill or his basic attack. So even in scenarios where if our Argenti is very far from getting his enhanced ultimate, it is advisable for players to just use Argenti's basic attack into Bronya's skill into Argenti's basic attack again, just to generate more energy, because 2 basic attacks with Argenti is actually equivalent to 46 energy, which can be quite substantial and even more than, for example, a single instance of a skill, right? So something for you guys to consider. Now, another support that is actually surprisingly well with Argenti, in fact one of the best across any of the DPS we've seen right now, is actually Yukong. Argenti is one of the only DPS in the game right now that can make use of even an E0 Yukong. Why is this the case? It's because Yukong is essentially our only burst support, providing a ton of crit rate, crit damage, and attack percentage at the expense of having a low uptime. This is completely irrelevant for Argenti. It doesn't matter if there's a very low uptime on Yukong's buffs, since, like I mentioned in the start again, 80% of Argenti's damage output is going to be coming from his enhanced ultimate. And one can very comfortably use Argenti's enhanced ultimate right after Yukong casts her buffs and casts her ultimate outside of Argenti's turn. And only Argenti, or rather not only, but Argenti is the unit we have right now where his ultimate does the most amount of damage across any DPS. So even at E0 Yukong, Argenti can still make use of the buffs provided by an E0 Yukong. Of course, E6 Yukong is still going to be a lot more comfortable, but I'm just saying that even at E0 Yukong is really good for Argenti. Then next, moving on to Tingyun, she's also another extremely synergistic support, and to nobody's surprise, just like how most of the other DPS have gone through so far, she can also enable a 2-turn ultimate with a specific rotation, especially if you have an E6 Tingyun. Tingyun's value can actually outperform Yukong as Argenti's crit ratio improves, right? Because the more crit ratio Argenti have, not to mention Argenti also has 25% crit rate from his traces alone, the value from Yukong's crit rate will become lesser and lesser, to the point where eventually if players' relics got strong enough, let's just say like 75% crit rate with 200% crit damage, if Argenti ever gets to that point, then Yukong's crit rate value will drastically fall off to close to 0, because essentially Argenti is already 100% crit rate. So if players' Argenti's relics, especially your crit ratio, is good enough, then Tingyun's value can steadily outperform eventually, right? Huo Tingyun is also an excellent support synergy, as seen from my previous Huo team analysis, due to how both of their energy batteries supports one another. Extremely comfortable, extremely smooth playing experience with Argenti. Now, one last support that I want to go through is going to be Hanya. Now, while Hanya was very synergistic as a single support, the value Hanya provides fall off in a duo support setup, because her buff multipliers, it is much lesser compared to Bronya, Tingyun, and Yukong. Her skill point positivity is still a really good thing, especially great for high skill point consumption scenarios, and she is still better than Pella, Asta, and other supports we have seen so far, right? But one thing to keep in mind, do not use Hanya that's less than E4 with Bronya, because Hanya's ultimate buff that's less than E4 only covers 2 turns. And at this point, I do want to quickly mention exactly how Hanya's ultimate buff works with Argenti when he casts it during his turn. Link will be down in the description below, right? But that being said, like I mentioned, after using Bronya's skill, right, if you were to cast Hanya's buff onto Argenti, if Bronya skills Argenti, that means an entire turn worth of speed buff is completely wasted, since Argenti just got an extra action value. Not to mention the amount of buff provided by Hanya goes down really fast once we tie her with Bronya. So if players really want to use Hanya, then they should use her with another support like Yukong or even Tingyun, instead of running both Hanya and Bronya in the same comp, unless you have an E4 Hanya. Now, with all that said, we have come to one final segment before we wrap up today's content. It's going to be a simulation output provided by Argenti's team comps, ranging from Bronya, Pella, Tingyun, Yukong, Hanya, and so on and so forth. The CM bros have done another chart over here, and this is gonna be my rough translation, as you guys can see over here, right? So some key things to note is that due to Argenti's variance between simulated damage and actual damage, this entire chart created by the CM community is not strictly representative of the actual damage output as compared to other simulations like Jingliu, Tingyun, because this kind of simulations, their rotations are essentially fixed. You always want to use the skill, you always know when to use the ultimate, but it's not the case for Argenti. So even for teams with more than 100,000 damage indifference on paper, can actually be very similar in reality, depending on the amount of rotations we actually get. All of the 4 stars here are also 6 stars unless stated otherwise. All of them have speed boots with 10 speed subs unless stated otherwise. And the best possible team comp, as highlighted in red over here, extremely optimized, right? With 176 Bronya as well as a 165 Yukong, as compared to some of the other teams, as you guys have seen over here, which is not as optimized compared to this. So there is a little bit of a bias in that sense. But the key finding, aside from all this damage output, aside from all these calculations, one key finding is that Argenti's damage scaling is more comparable to a destruction target when it comes to versusing 1, 2, 3 targets as compared to an erudition target. So what do I mean by this is that his damage scaling, as you guys can see from the chart, it goes up from ×1 to ×1.5 to ×2 for 1, 2, and 3 enemies. But for typical erudition units, their AoE is evenly distributed across everybody, right? And the damage for an erudition unit should look more something similar to like a ×1, ×2, and ×3. Since the damage they output to either 3 mobs or 5 mobs, it scales exponentially, whereas for Argenti, his bounces is only 6 bounces. So in that sense, the amount of damage that Argenti's enhanced ultimate damage can provide is essentially fixed, and that's why his scaling is comparable to a destruction unit. And at this point, some players might think, since Argenti's damage scaling is comparable to a destruction unit, how does he fare against Jingliu so far? Another very rough calculation as seen from the CN community here is that his damage is actually really comparable. For most scenarios, Jingliu out damage Argenti by a slight margin, but in the most optimized team comp, as you can see over here with the E0S1 Bronya with a 165 speed Yukong, Argenti actually manages to slightly outperform Jingliu by a very small margin. And once again, like I said, this is not representative of the actual damage output because a lot of things can happen in real life, but this is just some food for consideration, just to show that Argenti, even and with this current setup, his damage can actually be comparable to Jingliu, which is one of, if not the best DPS we have right now. So the players that are thinking Argenti's damage is just gonna be mediocre, I hope that this content helped you guys to change your mind. In summary, Argenti has a much more fluid team comp than people give him credit for, going beyond the energy battery setup with Tingyun and Huo. The team comps that Argenti use is also dependent on whether do we use speed boots, attack boots, energy regeneration rope, or attack rope, right? And one thing to keep in mind, if there's one takeaway, is that Yukong provided excellent results with Argenti even at E0, so do give Yukong a try if you have been forsaking Yukong for the past couple of months, right? And at the end of the day, it is quite hard to determine a best team since the benchmark for MOC10 Zero Cycle can be easily achieved without very optimal team comps. And like I mentioned, Argenti's rotation also drastically changes based on the number of enemies as well as all the kind of RNG factors that affects Argenti's enhanced ultimate uptime. Alright, so two possible team comps that players can consider. For high damage per ultimate, we can use a Bronya Yukong for extreme amounts of damage, and for smooth playing experience, then Tingyun and Hanya can be another alternative. Right, experiment with yourself because theory can only go so far. And with that, we have come to the end of Argenti's CN team comp analysis. If you guys wanted to engage in further discussions, leave a comment down in the description or just hop onto my Discord, the Pokke's Village, with a very active community talking about Honkai starrail on a daily basis. If you guys want to check out my stream, that's going to be at twitch.tv/MrPokke, where I stream 2 to 3 times a week, and the schedule will be updated on Discord as well. Once again, thank you guys so much for 30,000 subscribers. All the best for Argenti pools, all the best for Hanya pools, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.